BREWtally podcast is proudly sponsored by Rockabilia.com. For over 30 years, Rockabilia has been the go-to destination for all things band merch. With over 500,000 items in their online store and collaborations with today's hottest bands, you're sure to find something you love. Use our code BREW10 at checkout and take 10% off your total order. So go pick up your favorite new piece of merch now over at Rockabilia.com. And now, on to the show.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing. This rings true because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard, and you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, and if you're not having fun doing it, you're gonna give up.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the BREWtallyspeaking podcast. I am your host, John, and this episode's guest is Eric Stenman. We are here to talk about the Barbarians of California. However, you may have listened to something that Eric has either produced, mixed, engineered. I mean, some of his earliest credits go back to the early 90s, working with bands like Far and Will Haven, doing stuff with like Luscious Jackson, training for Utopia, doing stuff with even MC Light back in like the 2000s, if memory serves me correctly, doing stuff with Census Fail, Deftones. The list goes on and on and on. Seriously, if you are not familiar with who Eric Stenman is, you should get educated. However, this conversation was really spurred by the Barbarians of California's debut album, and now I'm just gnashing my teeth. Again, it's out now. If you haven't heard it, I don't know where you've been, because I actually have talked about it quite a bit on the Instagram live things I've been doing when I've been making these things that I'm currently doing. But basically, it's a band featuring Aaron Bruno from AWOLNATIon, obviously a longtime collaborator with Eric. So this was just kind of a love letter, essentially, of post-hardcore, sort of, that the guys all grew up on. And I think if you have been an avid fan of the sound for a very long time, you're going to pick up on a lot of the influences. And honestly, even the guests that are on this record, from Rick from Strife, Tim from Rise Against, and Daryl from Snapcase, those I think would be indicative of, if you know any of those bands, the guys from those bands, or any of the bands that they are from, their music, then I'm pretty sure you're going to like this record. So all that said, one of the other big selling points for me, being a big fan of behind-the-scenes people, was sort of getting to pick Eric's brain a little bit more about the longevity of his career. But I mean, again, like I said, if you look at the diverse nature of artists he's worked with, between MIA, MC Light, Training for Utopia, Deftones, Crosses, Will Haven, We the Kings, I think there's even a 303 record in there if memory serves me correctly. But it's a thing where the dude has worked on just such a wide range of artists and music. And to me, that's just so cool, and a kind of, especially from a production engineering, the way a record and songs sound, to me is really interesting, because it's traversing from mid-90s to now, the way that music has changed, how we take it in, from the physical media side of it's on a tape, it gets recorded on a reel or tape, goes onto a cassette. Now it's a CD. Now it's, this. Now it's going to be straight digital for the most part. Now things are being mixed and mastered specifically for vinyl. There's so many different things. Think of the loudness wars back in the day. The way that he has had to traverse his career in sound is really interesting to me. So to kind of be able to pick someone's brain that's been a part of this for so long and isn't just defined to one thing is really interesting, but also kind of, navigating, working with so many different types of people, and, maybe sort of expectations of if you work with so-and-so, this is what you can expect. And I think for me, another big one too, and I don't think I did a really good job of asking this at the time, but, working with bands that in my head have such a defined sound, a defined style, I know he didn't necessarily like produce the Deftones, but to work and engineer and do all these kind of things, I'm sure he has to kind of be very aware of like the sound that they have and maintaining that. And so to me, I feel like that would be kind of daunting as well of like, okay, do I have any liberties to kind of tweak something to bring something out a little bit more as I hear fit or something like that. But to me as a whole, this was just a really cool opportunity to get to talk to a kind of a legend in the game. And if you don't know who he is, well, you're about to find out. So without further ado, this is my conversation with Eric, and I'll talk to you on the other side of it.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to do this chat. It was kind of interesting. I kept seeing the email for the name, and it's always funny because I feel like when you get these press emails, which a lot of people probably are not used to seeing, but it gets interesting how I talk about how in doing this, the description of what the band is will be like 12 adjectives long, and there's like 18 paragraphs to describe why you should want to listen to the band or any of this kind of stuff. And it was kind of refreshing to see your guys' band bio and it not really feel like that. Like it feels like it's what I want when I get an email, where it's just like, it's a little bit of a descriptor of who's in it, kind of the mission statement of sorts. And then just, if it sounds interesting, listen to the music, let the music do the talking, not like a soliloquy or monologue of why you should listen to this band. And so to me, I guess I kind of wanted to start off there. It seems like the band, from my perspective, is very much trying to do this as much on its own accord, like letting the music speak versus the pedigree of who's in the band. How important was that when creating Barbarians of California?
Well, I'm glad it's coming off that way. I know exactly what you mean. How many times can you say intensity and brutality? And I mean, you had brutality on your screen. That's how that popped into my name. But I know when describing a new band on a heavier side, yes, it could be laden with, the same 15 words you're going to see in every other release. So I love that it struck you that way. But yes, we are doing this both. I think from the release standpoint, we're doing it all on our own. It's self-released, it's self-produced, and so in that regard, it's coming from us and speaking for ourselves. So sure, let's go with that. I like it.
Well, I mean, something that's kind of been an omnipresent topic the last handful of episodes that aren't out yet, but will have been by the time we put this out, is sort of kind of understanding the business side of things, of like understanding why you may or may not need a manager at this point, why you do or don't need a label, and the kind of processes of figuring that out for yourself. Because I think there's so many people who listen to this show that maybe are in bands fascinated with the behind the scenes stuff. So how did you guys land on that we wanted this to kind of be a self-released and self-funded, kind of, maybe not funded, but everything, like kind of DIY? Why or why not was that important to you guys doing this?
Well, we didn't set out with a certain mission statement. We discussed the label idea. We maybe even sent the music around a little bit, but when things just weren't coming together in any way that we were happy with, we said, "Oh, we'll do it ourselves." And it's a whole new world now. Especially the rest of the guys in the band have been playing constantly for the last, couple decades or whatever. But for me, last time I was writing and releasing music was in the early 2000s, and there were so many gatekeepers back then. You had to kind of go through, even as an indie band or whatever level, you would have to book studio time and really focus in on that time frame that you had. And sometimes it wasn't very long. You had to get it all done, then you had to hand it off to whatever record label. Sometimes it took them 6 months to get it into their schedule. You're waiting around. Nowadays you can write a song, record a song, and it can be out in the world in a week. And so as we were putting songs together, we just thought, we're not going to wait around, and who knows what we'll do in the future. But for now, because we could be very self-sufficient, we just went with that path. And it's with anything, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because there's so much music now. So anytime anyone does release a song into the streaming world, you're obviously up against the other 500,000 songs that came out that week. But it's also it's a great equalizer as far as your music is there on the platform next to the biggest artists in the world, and it's just up to you to gather attention and get people to check your what you're doing out.
I feel like it's got to be sort of a an interesting conundrum for you to kind of maybe navigate, because when knowing I was going to be talking to you, something that I wanted to ask, because I think it's an interesting way of thinking about things, but you from more of the production side, it's like I could see you getting to a point where when you're done with the record, by the time you're getting it, it's kind of the end point. And I often wonder, how often do you keep track of what you're working on, like how it's doing out in the wild? Like, or is it a thing where this was on my plate, I did it, it's done, now it's on kind of the next thing, I can't really focus on what that's doing out in the world? But you've worked on some pretty big records over the career. And so to me, it just kind of makes me wonder, like, is it interesting to kind of work on this yourself and then kind of be like, oh shit, now I have to like be actively involved in the rest of this along the way, where that's not a normal part of my process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's always certain releases you pay more attention to, some just because of the whatever fire they catch, or some do just kind of fade into obscurity. And I mean, there's plenty of records you'll hear 10 years later and you go, oh, wow, I forgot I even did this. Or like, wow, I can't believe that snare drum sounds better than any of the snare drums I'm recording right now. What did I do back then? So yeah, it's a different side of things. And I actually, I feel kind of like a 16-year-old kid again, because I started off playing music, and obviously at that age we're all very indie artists. I mean, I remember walking around the parking lot of a teen center trying to sell $5 T-shirts after a show. So there are definitely parallels that are full circle moments happening now, where I've been mailing out the shirts that people are buying on the website, and compiling the vinyl pre-orders. And so it's very cool. It's very, it's a very fun full circle moment. And yes, it is different to have I definitely have more of a dog in the fight now. It used to be, I'd work on however many records per year, and then I hand them off to the powers that be, whether, labels, the managers, the artists themselves, and they go off into the world with that product. Now it is definitely a different scenario, being much more involved.
I was trying to do some quick research, something I don't really like to do, but I also try not to put my foot in my mouth when best avoided. So
yeah.
Is this one of the first things that you have been a part of, as far as like actually being in the band in quite a while? Is that
in quite
correct?
a while? Yeah, absolutely. I've throughout the years, there's been, I've played on a couple things, sometimes credited, sometimes not. Sometimes in the studio, or when you're mixing, you're like, oh, I wish they would have beefed up this chorus guitar a little more, and I may or may not have dropped something in, here or there. But yes, as far as being a full band member, this is the first time since the early 2000s. So it's I was wasn't sure if that part of my life had passed, and I was just on to the other side, which I love. I love being the guy behind the guys and girls, and just doing the studio side. I have a definite passion for it, but it's also, as I've said, it's been a lot of fun just to step back over into both worlds.
So what I was going to kind of get to is, I think it's interesting to talk to people who have been in the kind of behind the scenes, producing, mixing, mastering, whatever, because over the decades that you probably have been doing this, you've amassed probably a giant collection of different ways to record, microphones, different technologies, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
When creating this record, was there much of a thought of how you wanted it to sound? Did you want it to kind of be more of the vibe and sounds of, I would say, to me, it sounds kind of like early 90s, like skater kind of stuff, like that you would hear in the background of like skate compilations and stuff. But it has the production of something kind of new and now.
Mm-hmm.
How much did you kind of want to marry those two, or was it just kind of a happy accident in the process of recording?
A lot of it just took care of itself, but that's a great summation. I think that the earliest genesis of at least from my role of creating any of the music that led to this was wanting to make something that I wasn't finding out in the world currently. You know, I'm a fan of heavy music, and a lot of metal has gotten so produced and so perfected and so clean, and I respect that, but I like having the rambunctious side. So, you know, you throwing in the kind of skate punk terminology, I love that. And so we definitely went into it. We wanted it to have life, but we did want it to sound current as well, you know. And so definitely it's there are give and takes on that. And you know, I think when we play live, it's going to be a little rowdier also, you know. So but that's a good, you're nailing it, you know. And that's what we were hoping for, or what I was hoping for.
Well, it's kind of funny because it's like at times I feel like I'm in the same boat as you. Like I'm literally about to turn 40 in 10 days. So sort of my frame of reference for a lot of this stuff is at times I feel outdated with some things. Like when listening to this, I was like, oh, this feels like, and I guess now you would almost call it metalcore is what it's kind of transitioned to, but it's kind of the old hardcore from me being out east, where it's like, you know, your Snapcases, your, you know, basically everyone you have on this record kind of indirectly. You know, you have Daryl from Snapcase, you have Tim from Rise Against, and Rick from Strife. And it's one of those things where it's just like, it feels like it pays homage to where it came from, the roots of this. And so it's hard not to hear it. But it's one of those where it's like a lot of times when I hear newer music and it'll be like for fans of, or you know, whatever, like I can pick apart some of the influences on a band's first record. Sometimes that's the endearing quality about it. Sometimes it makes me feel like my dad when I would listen to music and bring it to him, where he goes, it just sounds like this. I just want to listen to that instead. Because like I don't want to hear a carbon copy of the thing. And I think that was something that was really interesting about this, the couple of songs that I've been able to hear off of this, is that it feels like the era it's kind of homaging, but it's because you came from that era. It's not like a direct ripoff where you're like, this is what we think it would have been like if we were alive at this point. And to me, like I said, someone that has been into this genre, this scene for a while, it's kind of refreshing to have like a new band where you're like, hey, it sounds like this. If you like this band or this band currently, like I hear a little bit of like Eat It, Now Better Lovers kind of thing, like kind of that. And I know that they were heavily inspired by, you know, Snapcase and a lot of those same bands that we just mentioned. So to me, it's one of those where it's like, it's a new band that's as old as the other bands and members in the bands I've been listening to for 20 something years, going, oh, it scratches that itch I really like. But I'm interested to see how it's gonna do for others. Like if newer people are gonna take to this, or if the demographic of who's gonna enjoy this is gonna be more people like me that are older.
Yeah, I think, you know, starting out, I think that's the case. And Aaron and I both, you know, a goal in starting this and bringing it into the world is just to stoke out our friends, right? And to make something that we would have loved when we were 18 or 20 years old or whatever. So yeah, it does harken back to 90s, early 2000s. It probably sounds more like some of that stuff than current day. So yeah, I don't know. Like we've even, you know, our first show is next month, and you know, we're wondering, like, is everyone in the show going to be 45 and like standing around the back? You know, because that's probably what I would do at mini shows. You know, I'm not going to claim to be the kid up in the front reaching for the mic to do the sing along. You know, so hopefully there's a mix, you know, of both.
I was gonna say, if me going to the Botch reunion shows out in Seattle last year, or even Refused when they came back, like, our any indication, us 40, 50-year-olds will still get down like we were 18, 19, 20, whatever, because the music just lives in you that much that it's like you have to do something, you know, to feel it. Like it's hard not to like listen to some of these songs, especially when you have, you know, the legacy with them, to not want to still be that active, you know, kid. But then, you know, the next day you'll be like, my ribs are bruised, I'm out of shape, and I should go do it. And Planet Fitness will get your money. But it's a thing where, to me, I don't know. This is kind of a breath of fresh air from a place that I don't know if it's where I would have expected it to come from. That was sort of, even in looking at the email when I got it, I was like, wait, who's associated with this? Because I listened to it first and then went back to the email, and I was like, huh. Like, it's not what I would have expected given who's in the band. But that's another interesting talking point to me, which is, I always find it interesting when people find success in something kind of a little left of center from where they started. And So I guess like let's talk about where your roots of kind of hardcore metal and all that kind of stuff. Where did that start for you?
So I grew up. I have distinct memories of being a kid where I wanted to be a music fan, but wasn't quite sure how to navigate it. Say I'm 12 years old. I love going to the record store, but I'm not even sure what to buy yet or what I'm supposed to be looking for. So at that, in those earlier days, I loved new wave. I loved Michael Jackson, just kind of more mainstream stuff. But what introduced me to heavier music, honestly, was the beginning was Thrasher magazine. In the back of Thrasher magazine, like seeing what skaters were listening to, because I loved skate culture. I loved every aspect of it. And so seeing Suicidal Tendencies, like, maybe the first time I saw that name was in Thrasher magazine, maybe Dead Kennedys. And then I made a good friend back then who he was a metalhead, and there was starting to be a crossover between metalheads and skaters. So he thought I was cool because I was a skater, and I thought he was cool because he had all the Slayer vinyl, whatever. So we kind of joined forces, and that he broke me more into the metal side. I may have introduced him to a little more of the punk side. And so, yeah, but I still carried a love for, I guess you'd call it early alternative music. There was a period of life where my favorite bands were probably Slayer and REM, and so I was always kind of splintered as far as not having a specific genre that I had to stay within. I always loved the Smiths, and then going into Morrissey. But then I loved, Voivod. Voivod was huge for me, like sci-fi metal. There was a period in my life I loved that. But then, when I started to play music at like 15 or 16, even though my bands weren't super punk, that was just the kind of the scene we could play in. And so, like I said, playing teen centers or playing living room parties and garages, and that was kind of the earliest days. And so I always had an affinity for the punk scene. I loved the do-it-yourself ideals of it. I gravitated to the DC scene, Discord Records. I thought anything on Discord Records, I was going to go and give it a listen. So yeah, it was just always a mishmash of music, but whether it's punk, hardcore, metal, that was always a big part of it. And so, like I said, coming around full circle now at this, later stage in life or whatever, it just seemed fun. Like and I probably haven't been recording as much heavy music in the last decade. It's gone in different directions. I did more of those types of records earlier on. So that was another reason why, just to, hey, if I'm not working on that music, I'm going to create some.
I always think it's fun to hear how people kind of find their way back to pleasing their inner child, essentially. Like, as I get older and like buy different things, like my wife will be like, why'd you buy that? And it's like, because it's fun. And I didn't like, some of it now is like with re-releases of things or being able to, the collectors community of sorts, finding different things where you're like, oh, I really wanted that when I was a kid and like I couldn't or whatever. So buying it and having the thing, and it's like, does it really do anything or add value in the general sense of the word? No. But does it kind of tap into something maybe that like we push down every day, like going to a work, doing the hustle? Sure. And so to me, I feel like it's got to be the same, and it is refreshing to hear it is the same, where you're like, this is kind of what I grew up in. And I haven't been able to do it maybe in the capacity I've been wanting to in a professional setting. So I'm just going to do it myself and kind of tap back into like being a kid.
Yeah, being a kid and like I said, making music that hopefully you would have loved when you're in your late teens, early 20s. And maybe now you have the capacity to do a better version of it, than you could have then, both whether it's technology wise or just your own skill set wise. So yeah, all of us are. I mean, you have to keep it in check, right? You don't want to be the weirdo that's like fully spending all your money on old, 7 inches that you may or may not have ever owned at the time. But yeah, it's whatever. This is I guess the cheesy term passion project. It's certainly just a passion project that we're putting out into the world, and with no real expectations. Not sure what will be happening a year from now, but so far it's just been fun at every step.
What's funny is I had this weird thought earlier today when listening to the couple of songs that are out now, and now in talking to you, I kind of wondered, could this be more of like a collective of sorts? And, you know, as you were kind of talking about, like, I'm into this, I'm into this, I'm into these kind of styles of music and so forth, that could each album kind of represent a different thing that you like grew up listening and were into. So like, this is the youthful aggression of my skate hardcore roots. The next one could be something like, you know, maybe it'd be like a synthwave record, or like a, you know, kind of like Tears for Fears kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sort of, you know, I look at someone like Mr. Bungle, for example, or even like something more current, like The Armed, where it's like they kind of have roots in this, but then just branch out and it becomes sort of whatever we want this to be. And every album doesn't have to be tied to a genre, to anything, or who is even in the band. It can just be a collective. Is that something you could see this project turning into, since there's kind of not really necessarily a definitive, this is what we will always be and how we want to tackle this 5 years from now?
I like that idea. You know, from my angle at this project, when I started it, I started just, if I'd come into work in the studio earlier, I'd stay late after a session and just record some ideas, right? I had no idea where it was going to go. And I figured best case scenario, I know a bunch of guys that are vocalists. I'll maybe just collaborate and get, you know, if I come up with something that I think is actually good enough to present to the world, I'll get some friends to perform on it as well. And so that collaborative aspect, certainly, yeah, this could morph, and, you know, other people could be involved. And that was kind of the genesis anyways. And when Aaron, you know, who I've worked with in AWOL now for over 10 years, I always wanted him to sing on a song or a couple songs. But like, once he started to hear it, he did one, he did two, he did three. And he said, dude, you know, we have a band now, right? Like, he said, this is a thing, you know, we can make this into a thing. So, yeah, that's a great question. You know, the identity of, like I said, it's an unknown territory of what's to come, you know? And so, sure. Synthwave, dark synthwave. Hey, let's put it on the table.
Well, it's one of those things, like, to me, I always think that's kind of the fun thing of, you know, some of the bands I mentioned, like, you know, I haven't had the pleasure of seeing Mr. Bungle, but it's funny to see now with them touring that they've essentially gone all the way back to what they started off as, and kind of became more of like a side thrash project essentially for Mike, and then grabbing like Scotty and a bunch of other guys in it to flesh that out. But to me, I always loved the eclecticness of music. And it's funny, as you were saying, like, you know, I got into, you know, Michael Jackson and all these things. It's funny being a fan of music, I think, of the era that, at least I'll say, of me growing up in the late 80s, early 90s. And it's funny when people say, like, well, how come you like this band? And I'm like, well, it sounds like shit, frankly. And to me, I was like, you got to remember, like, me growing up in the 80s and early 90s, like, everything had a pop sheen to it. Like, the metal that was coming out at the time, out of LA and so forth, had like a pop production to it. You know, everything from pop and everything had great production. So it's one of those things to me where that was sort of the thing that kept me out of punk and hardcore for a while, was it just sounded like shit. It sounded like the whole emphasis of why everyone loved it was recorded in a basement with one microphone in the middle of the room. Doesn't it sound awesome? Aren't these songs great? And it's like, no, like, I can't hear, I can't make anything. It sounds awful. So to me, it's kind of funny to navigate this, where a lot of people, I think, are gatekeeping still to this day, where it's like, well, you're not a real fan of this if you're not into this, or don't ride for this. And to me, it's like, I just like music, man. If it sounds good, that's all I want. And it doesn't matter if it comes across where you're a thrash band now or a hardcore band or whatever, and then morph into something else. If it's authentically who you are, it's going to come across. And to me, I think that's why, thinking about it, I was like, Barbarians of California. Like, California is kind of a melting pot of a lot of different styles, people, everything. So that's why I was like, I could see this, given the background of everyone in it. But it's like, you could kind of take this anywhere, and the name still works, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, one thing Aaron has said is, because we made the Barbarians record right alongside the new AWOLNATION record, and so he didn't say this while we were doing it, but it kind of came to his mind after that. It's almost a double album for him, you know, from his perspective, but it freed him up. AWOLNATION, especially when they play live, has had a heavier side, but some of the records always have a song or two that are, you know, a little more aggro. But this kind of in many ways freed him up to do a separation, to lean heavier one side and one project and the other way and the other. So in that regard, as long as Aaron is involved with this, I mean, definitely we each have our kind of bipolar music fandom that will enter in, and so maybe they'll stay separate. But yeah, I don't know. I think even as you hear the rest of what is the full length record, you'll see that just within this batch of songs, more ground is covered than maybe what was revealed just in the first couple of releases. So sure, maybe that'll go even further moving forward.
I'm interested to hear by the time I get to Mexico. I think when I saw all the track listing, that was the one I was like, what is that? What is that going to sound like?
Yeah.
Because like in my head, I could see it going a few different ways.
Yeah. Those are some of my favorite lyrics on the record. So yeah. It's fun having, I mean, it's coming up close, quick now, like the record will be out in less than a month. So as I said, we were releasing the first couple singles while we were still finishing the album. So it is kind of a new world in that regard, but still there is the waiting game, for you to hear the lyrics to that song. And so I'm glad it piqued your interest. I think it won't disappoint.
Well, it'll be kind of cool. I always think it's interesting to figure out how a band goes about, and I know there's more people like the label, whatever, but given the fact that there's not one, how did you go about picking which songs to choose? Because I mean, a lot of times I feel like you see the singles and they're all together. Like when you look at the DSP, they're either the first four, right in the middle, whatever. And I feel like you kind of did that where it's like the middle of the record is kind of the singles, but then also the last song, Far Out Bro, is a single as well. So I feel like we're kind of essentially I'm kind of interested because it's like, well, usually I know the front half of the record's front loaded. Mm-hmm. We don't really know that necessarily. So it's interesting that it's like you're saying the middle, by definition of how singles work, you are saying the middle is kind of right where the sweet spot is of like, we think these are our best songs. So I always think that's interesting when looking at it like that from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to ask me today, and I think Aaron feels the same way right now, the first song in the album is my favorite song. And so it's also one of the newer songs. So you always have a bias maybe of something newer. It seems more fun and fresh, right? So yeah, this is another conversation we've had. We remember like the 90s, right? The 90s, early 2000s, where there seemed to be a pattern where bands would release a first single, it'd be kind of a heavy hitter, kind of, upbeat, whatever. And then maybe the second is along those lines, and the third would be what they're going to be really the big single. And that's more of the, if not a ballad, it's more of a pop structure and a little more palatable, so that's kind of like the release pattern we grew up. Just, whether even a band like Helmet, I felt like maybe followed those guidelines, or anybody that's signed to a major label, there seemed to be kind of a game plan. So us choosing the order of these songs, I mean, there was part of me that I did wish we could just do the full album reveal at once, right? The kind of the old school kid in me liked the idea of no one having a preview of it and having the full batch of songs come out at once. But I was very torn between the fun process of when a song's done, let's put it out, right? And so the first song, Dopamine Prophecy, I always thought that's a good representation of a lot of what you'll hear throughout the rest of the songs. It covers some different territory. Far Out Bro, we were anxious to get something with one of our friends on it, right? So we were so psyched that Daryl's on that song. We love the way he sounds on it. And so that was a reason for kind of having that come out amongst the first, that's the third song. And so anyways, we're just kind of, we're taking input from other people, but Aaron and I are making those decisions. And the good news is there's not one song on the album that I want to hide, so anything, anything that we would have decided to kind of do a pre-release on, I would have been fine with. And, there's no track 8. They're like, that one we just fit in there to fill out the record. I still have fun with all the songs.
Well, it's fun kind of talking about the release of music now, because I have staunchly kind of been like, I'm sort of over this whole, you get half of a record before the record even comes out. And I get it I get it a lot more now. It was kind of explained to me somewhat recently in the last probably 5 or 6 months that obviously with the DSPs doing what they do, the long rollout of the songs and so forth not only allow for pre-orders and all that kind of stuff to kind of slowly trickle in, but more to the point, it allows the numbers on the DSPs of the singles to then get morphed into the full record numbers and so forth. So from that perspective, still makes a lot of sense. It's still sort of the industry doing what they've always done, which is finding a way to, I hate to say it like this, but it's like find a way to sort of inflate the numbers a little bit beyond maybe what they really were. Before it used to be packaging albums with ticket sales, which can't do that anymore. Used to be putting, a DVD or an extra CD in with your CD. That counts as 2 sales for every one. There's always been kind of a thing that they'll do. So I get it a lot more now, but I think I'm more of the mind that, I grew up where it's like you had the one promotional single essentially, and then maybe like right before the record comes out, you get the other single to kind of keep interest. But it's like there wasn't these long rollouts like there seems to be now. And I kind of, like I said, I get it, but I kind of miss what's the rest of like kind of that anticipation. But I feel like we as fans, got burned a lot in kind of the 90s, early 2000s, where it's like the single sounded great and the rest of the record, like you said, was just shit you didn't really put as much effort into, maybe because you knew you could skate by those 3 singles to sell the record and then go gold, platinum, whatever. And yeah, so it's kind of interesting that you guys possibly struggled with how you wanted this to go. How have you found that though? How have you found maybe navigating the newer way of having to put out music than from when we started?
So like I said, it's a give and take, right? One thing from just, if I take myself out of being a player or a writer, when I would, as an engineer, mixer, producer, work on records, when a full album comes out, I do, now that like you look at Spotify or you look at YouTube and you can see the stream count, right? I did hate the fact that a lot of times certain songs did just get lost. You may have a huge discrepancy between whatever song caught fire on a record and has, however many million streams on Spotify versus, like I said, track 7, track 8, track 9, these songs, like you remember just blood, sweat, and tears going into these songs, and they have 1/10 of the listeners of the single, and so, hey, some of that is just the fans dictate, right? People, the market dictates, and that's fine. But the benefit of releasing a song at a time is everything gets a little more attention, right? When you put out 10, 12 songs, human nature is maybe, especially in this fast-paced, short attention span world, I don't know how many music fans are doing start to finish. I mean, and I'm guilty of it as well. I love playlists, that I make myself or like that friends share. So yeah, it's a give and take, right? Between the big reveal of the full album at one time, you hope someone sits down with their headphones on, listens from start to finish, versus just the kind of the quick fun reaction you get. Like I said, when a song's done, let's put it in the pipeline and get things going, and I wouldn't say it dictated how we finished the record, but it is instant feedback in many ways. And it does give you I think anyone, usually when making a collection of songs, you want to kind of fill in some holes and cover some ground. And so when you're already releasing songs, it's even like a fast forward on that. So yeah, I don't know. With anything in life, right? There's the give and take of it. And but yes, I remember the downside of the old world, as you just said, is, I remember being a kid in a record store holding up whether it's a CD or vinyl, and thinking, which one's better? Which one's going to be better? Which one's going to get screwed and it's going to have 2 cool songs and a bunch of junk? And which one is going to be a full listen, right? And so, that is the kids now just don't have that. I mean, they don't have the magic of owning physical music, but they also can just sample and cruise through the whole artist catalogs from start to finish. Then they can collect the songs they like better, and they didn't get stuck with the one record that had a great song and a bunch of complete filler.
It was an interesting talking point with Dennis DeYoung, formerly of Styx, because he was sort of quick to blame my generation, even though I don't think he necessarily knew how old I actually am. Mm-hmm. He's like, oh, all you nowadays, it's playlists and it's songs. And I was like, no. Like, I pushed back because I was like, dude, this is all kind of going back to when you were a kid and it was all singles driven based off 7 inches that radio stations would play. Potentially there'd be a B-side that would get the artist some more traction before the next song. But we've gone back to what the industry kind of has always been, which was a singles driven thing that then the artist could tour off of the success of that one song or a couple if they've had that kind of longevity at that point. But I think the other thing too is like you were part of the era of the fans that wanted to make full-on albums that you sat there and listened to as creative. Unfortunately, I think some other people came in and either phoned it in or knew that we could write one or two really good songs and some others that were just and you're going to buy that record. And by the time you realize the rest of it, shit, it doesn't matter because we got your money. And on the flip side of that, on the touring side, we just know we're not going to play those. So it's fine.
Yeah.
And it kind of created, I think, this shift in what I like to say responsibility. I think the artists and the people that are creating the albums now realize it's like, oh, we can't just kind of rest on our laurels and phone it in. Like it's going to be pretty obvious. And then that's going to affect every aspect of our career in this. Like, you know, if the album doesn't do well, the singles don't do well, then people aren't going to show up to our shows. I mean, I think Motley Crue kind of famously is a great example of that. You know, they put out Theater of Pain, had two pretty big singles. Record sucked. And then, they... Good.
It also that I think that plays a bigger part at whatever point in the career of the artist it is, right? When, right now we have this one batch of songs and it's like the chip on our shoulder says they all got to be strong, right? Like I know if you're on your fourth record, absolutely. Like you can say, that song, it's okay. But yeah, we'll never play it live because we'll lean on our songs that everyone else knows. And, but the stakes are higher when you're a new band, new project. And so, I think it wasn't fair of him to say, oh, your generation. Because the 70s and 80s were littered with filler albums with, like you said, whether it's the single, remember the singles or the 7-inch singles,
yes.
Those were, there was certainly plenty of examples of all genres where people leaned on a strong song and then a bunch of whatever,
Is it, I definitely don't have to mention names. Is it obvious when you're working on a record? Like where it's like, oh, these were the ones that everyone kind of did, like really what they're all into, and then the rest of the record is kind of very whatever. Like, is it obvious when you're doing like mixing, mastering, and all that stuff to you?
Honestly, no. And some of that is it's our own bias, right? But artists normally think whatever they're working on is the best thing they've done yet, right? And so, like, I guess the good news is yes, when I've been behind the curtain, whether they're misguided and their expectations aren't in line with reality, everyone I work with is doing their best, and I don't see throwaway songs being made. We all can have our own opinions of which ones are more worthy. And, even within from the first day you start to work on a song to the day you finish it. And sometimes the world aligns with your idea and sometimes not. There's plenty of songs or plenty of albums where whatever the priority track ends up being is far from my favorite, and I think artists feel that same way as well. And so it's a mixed bag. But yeah, the good news, I guess, in my experience is that no, I don't have instances of people fully knowing that, like, well, let's spend 2 days on this one and it'll be good enough to fill somewhere in the record, so that's the good news. But sometimes they're also that may be the case and they're just too in their own head to have picked up on it yet, like, I don't know. And then it also too, from a production side, one thing I always have thought is, and it's such an interesting thing, you can make a record with the same players and the same studios, a lot of the same guitars and equipment, and certain songs just sound better from that time frame, right? Like certain, just the pieces, the key choices, the tuning choices, which come out better. So even from a technical side, there is something that can happen. And this is maybe a sideline tangent that no one cares about, but like I feel that way with every record I've ever worked on. Certain songs may not be the best song, but they sound the best technically to my ear, so that popped into my head. It wasn't your question.
No, well, I mean, you kind of, it's almost like you serendipitously fell into a question I've been wrestling with for probably I'm being honest, probably at least a decade. Because I've been trying to figure out, I worked at a bar for a little bit and I go to a lot of shows and stuff like that. And so obviously I'm just surrounded by music that's being played overhead, at a show, whatever's on the PA between bands that someone is picking, whatever. And, I grew up and my parents grew up listening to, like 70s, 80s stuff. And then, I kind of found my way through music. But I always think it's interesting, like, what is it about Aerosmith? What is it about Queen? What is it about Elton John? What is it about these legacy, like giant artists? What is it about their music that it doesn't matter if you are 10 now in 2024, where you're hearing and you're like, this sounds amazing. Why is this music so timeless, but stuff that's coming out now just seemingly isn't? Like, I was joking with my wife. I was like, why is it that Bohemian Rhapsody is still getting listened to by people who probably don't even listen to Queen outside of that, or don't really listen to that style of music or that era of music, but they'll still listen to the shit out of Bohemian Rhapsody? Why is that song so enduring and timeless? And I go, and the only song I could ever come up with at the time is, I was like, I mean, do you really think WAP's going to be around 40 years from now, where we're like, oh man, this just takes me back?
Well, that's such a challenge, right? And it's magic in a bottle, because none of us know what's being created right now that will be valued in 40 years, right? And so, it's certainly something I've had in mind as I've come back into being a performer. Try to have perspective, and we can't really, but try to have some perspective on making a choice that could be timeless. But I think it's something worth having in your head, but it's also kind of a fool's errand, right? To think you're actually going to pull it off. But both myself, from music I either played on or recorded in the 90s, like some of it is cringeworthy, right? Some of it, really doesn't age as well and then other pieces of music do. And so, yeah, it's so hard to say. Yeah, AC/DC, those records sound perfect now, right? There are just certain artists, and it's funny that as we age, some stuff you fight against as a kid, especially like a punk rock kid, you have to kind of come to terms with it. Like, I remember being resistant to Led Zeppelin and thinking, oh, that's like, when I was a kid, that was kind of dad rock of its own type, right? And like everyone said, oh, John Bonham's the best drummer, and I think no, there's guys in my generation that are better drummers than John Bonham. I got a little older. John Bonham probably is the best drummer ever, And I mean, my first, I guess if I was to back up even further in my history with music, is the Beatles. As an 8-year-old kid, my best friend and I would listen to his dad had all the Beatles records on vinyl, and we'd sneak in and listen to those. And so what a music lesson those records served as. And I never resisted the Beatles. I always I always stuck with them as kind of pinnacles of accomplishment of songwriting structure and creation. So but yeah, creating something timeless. And of course, within genres, some people will never like a certain genre, like whether it's country music can be a very controversial subject, right? There's some country music I actually absolutely adore. There's others I have a hard time with. And I'm sure people on the outside of anything that's punk or hardcore, I mean, some people are always going to be resistant to anything that just has that kind of level of nastiness to it, So, but yeah, hopefully these songs, hopefully we're still proud of them in 20 years. But yeah, that's certainly a goal.
I just had a weird epiphany as you were kind of saying that, and kind of talking about different genres, like kind of how it makes you feel and like all that. Because I was like, I remember growing up, my dad being big into like Thin Lizzy, and that was a band when I was a kid, and I would listen to, and people were like, "What the fuck are you listening to?" And I'm like, "This album, Jailbreak, rules!" Like songs like Emerald and like Running Back to You and stuff like that. Like these are like, it's a band that like kind of covered a few different genres within what they do. But it just hit me where I was like, bands like Led Zeppelin, bands like Thin Lizzy, those bands of the day. And this is my correlation, I think, to why I got into like hardcore and stuff, is it felt like they were a gang, essentially. Like they were like, you would never not envision them all together. And there was something about that, I think maybe that sense of community, even if it's just 4 or 5 of you against everyone else, that it was kind of like, it feels dangerous, it feels cool, it feels like something, I don't know, it like you wanted to be a part of that. And I feel like maybe that's when I think back to like when I started getting into more aggressive music, I think that's why it felt like, you know, I think about a band like Biohazard. It's like I imagined all those dudes hanging out with like their best friends, and they were a rowdy group, and like, you know, you probably secretly wanted to hang out with them, but were too afraid because like you're like, I don't think I can keep up with what they do or whatever. And I think as I learned more about like a band like Thin Lizzy, it's like, yeah, same thing. I think Phil, not by all accounts, was a piece of shit dude, but is also one of those you secretly still wanted to have like you for some reason. And I don't know, I guess I've never put that correlation together of why I kind of like old classic rock and things like that, and how it traverses into me getting into like hardcore and punk and all that stuff. But I think it's a sense of community and belonging and finding your people.
Hardcore and punk, absolutely. One thing I don't know if kids would do anymore today is, do you remember, we would look at the thanks list on an album, or we would pay attention to the band t-shirts that our favorite band was wearing, and we would go and listen to those bands because we didn't have a playlist, we didn't have an algorithm, we didn't have the ability to just flip through a million songs any given day. So we really paid attention to that community, and yeah, like you said, kind of a gang, like especially like hardcore and like the New York hardcore scene. The thanks list would be this long, and like half of them would be bands, right? And so I fully paid attention to that. And, I loved Agnostic Front, and I'd see like, oh, Agnostic Front thanked Gorilla Biscuits, or, or Youth of Today, or, whoever it was. And so absolutely paid attention to that. And yeah, I know what you mean as far as like, there was some intimidation of like, certain bands like did feel like tough gang guys, and like you might not be able to hang with them. But then a lot of times if you made an attempt, and like especially within the hardcore scene, there was an accessibility. And I remember talking to various bands at the merch booth and whatever, and that was a big realization that maybe I can make music too at that age. It was, I loved that punk and hardcore kind of broke down the door of that shining artist up on the hill, right? That like, I'll never be able to, play a stadium like Led Zeppelin or Rush, but I'm watching this music that I feel passionate about play in a venue that's still somewhat accessible. It feels small enough that you're a part of the show. You're not just watching an ant on a stage at an arena, and so all those moments really struck me and resonated with me. And like I said, when I was 12, I thought, boy, I'd love to play music, but I don't know anybody that does that. I don't have lessons. I don't know how to, enter this big music industry. But then getting into punk, once again, for better or worse, there's plenty of punk bands that maybe shouldn't have been on a stage because they didn't have a talent level even to get to that. But just using your talent level to be creative, right? Like I've never been an amazing guitar player, but I feel like I can be good enough to accomplish what I want to put into the world. But you're not going to hire me to go and play with artist X, Y, and Z on any given night. I'm not that guy, and that's kind of the punk side of me,
When this is kind of the downfall of like not prepping and trying to be more focused and in the moment, is like when I have a thought, I have to kind of like figure it out in an actual,
sure,
like, make this make sense. With when you're kind of working on records, given kind of the expansive nature of what you've worked on, do you feel like that allows you to pull out some of these, maybe like, I guess the best way I can kind of describe it. So like a band like Deftones, maybe like there's a part where it's more, synth kind of things, kind of more electronics, and you kind of want to give that a little bit more room to kind of breathe for the guitars that are maybe going to come in and kind of like hit a little bit harder. So I feel like that would be a thing where like if you're kind of into more of that like 80s kind of like synthwave and stuff like that, we're like, okay, I know that this needs to do this, but I also know because I'm into this, like this thing needs to come in like this to kind of balance itself out, but like allowing the sonic textures that need to be to kind of do what they need to be. Are you aware of that when that's happening, when you're mixing or mastering or working on a song, like the individual elements that need to come out and be presented for front and center? Like, is that something that you are aware of? And I might be doing a piss poor job of asking that question.
No. I mean, you absolutely have to be, right? But it's in many ways, it's like a puzzle that can be fit together. It doesn't have one solution, you know? So dynamics are such a huge thing, right? But for one part to sound big, sometimes you have to try to make another part smaller, you know, and like and you hate doing that at times, right? You know, but the effect that the listener will have, it's a balancing act. And so, yeah, you know, music, I feel so fortunate to get to every role I've ever had in music, and I've done everything from, you know, I've done everything to kind of avoid the real world. I've toured with bands, I've mixed live sound, I've been a tour manager. But yeah, I feel so lucky to get to work with different aspects of music, and to try and, you know, take everything you've learned over every year, and it's all in your color palette, right? So when you're going to create something new, hopefully you can maintain that passion and that level of care to try to bring everything to the current project. And then sometimes, but you can't force it also, you know, you can't force it to be something it's not. I mean, actually, sometimes you can, and sometimes it works, and sometimes you cannot. And sometimes, you know, you have to take the artist, every artist is different. I always say one of the most important things of being on the studio side of things is knowing a lot of times you just need to shut up and be quiet and let the songwriter or the artist get to the point where they need input or need advice. Because I see some like especially younger engineers who just don't know when to shut up, and they're just chiming in, and they think they're being helpful and they have best intentions, but you need to let people get to the point where they're ready to hear an opinion or to hear a different route that may or may not work.
I feel like that's, as someone who in my listening musical journey, like really would focus in on producers, like it's funny to think about, like you were saying earlier about like when you get the CD, you're looking at the thanks list, you're looking at all the credits essentially, that, you know, I know there were people who would be like, oh, if this producer's on it, I'm fucking grabbing it regardless, because I know that person just brings out something in a band. And the thing I always think is interesting as I've gotten older, thinking about just the songwriting aspect as a whole, like, you know, I've talked about working with a band that I had friends in, and, you know, I'd get demos and it'd be like, okay, here's the demo of this song. And you're like, oh, this is a really good hook, or this is a really great song start to finish. Then you get like some pre-pro done, then you get like the first mix and master, then the final, and just everything in the process of the song coming out the way in its final form, how different everything, little minute decisions can be, how you're like deciding to produce and mix like the acoustic guitar. It's too bright. It's a somber song. You don't want it that bright. You kind of want it more like docile and all this kind of stuff. Like just little decisions like that can drastically change how a song is. So I always feel like, given what you guys do, it's almost the same, like on a way bigger scale. It's almost like when someone hands me a song and then goes, let me know what you think of this. And you're like, oh shit. Like it's a big responsibility. So I couldn't imagine being handed songs and then you're like, all right, I have to figure out the sonic ways that I hear this going to make it be what I think the person wants. I feel like that would be such a daunting task of like, where do you start? And then is there still trepidation on your end, even now, where you're like, I'm handing it in, I hope you like it, even though I have all these years and years of experience?
For sure. And there's been times when I've been hired to mix, like say it's an album I haven't been involved with, but I'm hired to mix it. And I turn in a mix that I'm just like, okay, I did it, right? I took what they gave me, I made it better. And that's not what they're going for, right? So, you know, it goes any which way, and it can drive you insane. And you know, there is a neurosis that comes with all the recording side of music. And yeah, I remember, you know, you mentioned producers that anything they worked on, you would want to try to pay attention to, and record labels were that way. You know, I mentioned Discord Records, but you know, Sub Pop Records was a huge thing. Victory and Revelation in the hardcore world, you know. So a lot of those barriers, I don't know if they exist anymore. And you mentioned album credits. I love album credits. I love seeing what studio is recorded at, who is the mixer, who's the mastering engineer. Younger music fans, they're missing out on a lot of that because, you know, The metadata has gotten better on, say, Apple or Spotify. They're showing some more credits that if you dive in, you can get there. But they have the potential to have every single aspect. It could say the drums were recorded on December 5th of 2022. I mean, they could really get precise if somebody was entering all that information. And so in some ways, as a music and studio nerd, the potential is there more so than ever, but it's actually covered less and documented less because of not having the physical copies. Not everyone has a physical copy of a record. So yeah, you certainly, especially if it's an artist you care about, you want to serve the project better, right? And hopefully they've hired you based on an aesthetic you've created in the past, and they want to bring some portion of that into their current project. But it's always a challenge to give any new music its own identity while also staying true to what you as a producer or them as an artist have already accomplished, right? And I think that's so hard when bands are making their 5th, 6th record, to stay fresh, right? To stay fresh and yet sound like what made you love that artist in the first place. I mean, that's a daunting task, and not many artists even get to make their 5th or 6th record, and not many, if they are lucky enough to do that, make their best record as their 5th or 6th record, right? It's hard. It's very hard.
Kind of a couple questions coming to mind as we start wrapping up. Is there something that you've worked on? And again, definitely don't need to say names, but is there something that you've worked on where either you thought it was going to be bigger than it ended up being, or something that totally surprised you where you're like, I can't believe this caught, not for lack of integrity or good songwriting, just didn't think it was going to break through the way it did? Like, are there still surprises like that for you in your career?
1,000%. Yeah. You, like I said, along the journey, you'll have favorites, and you think like, this is this band, this artist's best work. I can't wait for the world to hear this, and it just kind of comes out and goes away, right? And then, to tie it into like our home team here, the song "Sail" by AWOLNATION. I always loved that song. When we were in the studio making, that was the first AWOLNATION record. There was already talk of like 3 other songs. Those will be the singles. But to me, "Sail" was just this weird, cool, slow, awesome album track, right? That I knew I would always be one of my favorites. And then that completely organically just grew up to be, one of the biggest songs of a decade. And it honestly happened because I think, one radio station, I think it was in Austin, Texas, started playing it. And it really was a situation where the phones were lighting up. People were calling, saying, what is that? And then pretty soon Portland was playing it and the phones were lighting up. And then Fort Wayne, Indiana was, and so that was really fun. Such a fun instance of a song that was near and dear to my heart, but I just thought it was going to be part of an album, right? Here's an album. These other songs will be the focus tracks. That'll just be one of my favorites. And it's the biggest thing I've ever worked on. You could probably take every other song I've ever had a finger on, and that one has been heard more than everything put together, and so those moments are just, they are there, and like it's
humbling is what I keep coming back to.
Yeah, I mean, it's humbling and just kind of inconceivable, right? You can't even you can't expect it. In that case, that's just a wild scenario of a song. But yeah, there are other bands, like, say take a band that has been around. I get to work on them on a project and I think, okay, that could be like their pinnacle record, and it's still not. It's the one they made when they were 19 that the fans just have such a soft spot for and love, right? And music is, so much of it is, it does hit us different at different points in our life, right? And we all have a nostalgia for the music we listen to between like 17 and 22, right? That'll be a sweet spot for, just about any generation. And that's why our parents said, I don't know about the stuff you're listening to. You need to listen to this. And sometimes they were right, and like, as we age, we have those realizations. And I heard someone recently talking about loving a song because they had memories of their dad, like driving around in their dad's truck listening to this song, and now they're in their 20s and that's their favorite song. And I have a couple of kids. I would hope to have a moment like that. Like so far, I don't know if they think dad's cool at all, right? And so, especially with music. They're younger. They're at the early stages of figuring out what type of music they may or may not like. But I love stories like that, right? And just kind of having a legacy of shared music that can cross generations. I mean, it's awesome.
I always think it's funny. Like I was looking at Facebook the other day, actually yesterday, as when we were doing this, and my Facebook memory was a tour I had booked with a friend of mine. And it was like almost 10 years ago. And I was stopped back and think for a second about the tour. And I just kind of looking at it going like, there's a weird butterfly effect from just this one show, like how it's the ripple effect for the rest of my life for like the last 9 years. And I was like, oh, it's so crazy. And I kind of started unpacking it. And I was like, I'm going to make a post about this. Cause like, it's one of those things to me where I think a lot of people don't, it kind of speaks to the butterfly effect of like everything has a reaction. You don't know how big it's going to be until way down the road. And it was just funny to be like, I booked this show. I was sent it. The dude, kind of going back to what we literally were talking about. It wasn't a long email about why I should book this show. It was just, I think you're going to like this song. Listen to it. Let me know. Here's the tour. Here are the dates. And I really liked the song. Became a fan of the band. The guy who shopped me the thing was in a band at the time and now is the bass player of Ice Nine Kills. And I'm just like, that's funny to be like, you and I's relationship started through this, then you left, and then now you're in a like opening for Metallica, essentially. Like wild. Thinking about how my wife and I went because of the band we had stay with us. Like we went to Connecticut, then we ran into these people, got in a car, Rhode Island, went to Connecticut, ran into another friend of mine that I made through booking shows, ended up meeting some other people down the road. This became this thing. Like, it was like 8 different pieces where I'm like, this is all interconnected because of this one email I got. These are all the people and the things that I did with my wife, with friends, whatever. And it's weird when you look back and can kind of think about these things where you're like, I don't know how you would just like, I don't want to say like a tracing moment or a tracking moment, but it's just crazy to look back at your life and these little things that seem insignificant at time. But then when you kind of are able to step back a little while later, you're like, wow, this took me here. And it's like, for me, the thing that was cool was it sort of was a great representation of how my time being a fan of music, getting into it from booking shows into doing the podcast and whatever, it kind of traverses all of my parts in this industry, like being a fan, being a part of it through booking shows because I wanted to bring good music to people who were too lazy to find it, to then even kind of realizing like that's a bit of a struggle because there's too much money on the line a lot of times when you're booking shows and having to like bite your fingernails going, shit, am I going to have to go to my own ATM and pull out the money that's not there? And that just got a little too much and I didn't enjoy it, and local egos and stuff. And then finding that it's like, I like talking to people about music, about what they do in it, and how it correlates to who you became and who you are. Because I think the journey of people is interesting. Like, how did we all find our way in this thing where you have unlimited options, but here we both are finding our way through a thing that we started as a passion of like, we just like music. So to me, I always find like those moments when you're able to look back really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean every aspect of life is that way, right? But music can make it even more special. And I mean, you brought up a topic that could be another 3-hour podcast, right? Just thinking about any moment of my experiences with music, and yes, the avenues they led to later. Some are very small, like being at the same show as someone you get to meet. Others are bigger. Of maybe I made a record with one group that became influential and led to me making 15 other records because people liked that one. And it may not even be the most, it's not a household name, but it was a band's band. There's always stories of the band's bands, right? That people in a scene or people in a genre or whatever just really gravitate towards. And if you as a working as any sort of professional in music, one job leads to another. And same with you, I'm sure booking shows, one relationship leads to another, one contact with one artist comes back around. And none of us know these moments and how to appreciate them. I think back on certain tours I did, or not even, sometimes just a collection of 3 shows that I did with an artist or whatever. And I just didn't appreciate it enough, right? And now I think back as such a golden era, of music and my life in music. And but once again, I think it can apply to any part of life. A lot of times we're so busy looking onto the next thing that we're not stopping to appreciate right where we are and what we've accomplished up to that point.
Well, I think that's the hard thing is, especially this industry is one where it's like, I stumbled across this. Granted, I was in the middle of a mushroom trip like 15 years ago or longer, maybe almost 20 now. But I got weirdly fascinated with the concept of time, of past, present, future, literally and figuratively. And it's something where I realized in talking to so many people doing this for, 8 years and almost 500 episodes, that it's a thing where whatever you're doing now that's inspiring you for the next creative thing you're working on, that you're in your present and your future. And then you have to go back to your past when you're doing something like this, like a record's been out, because I'm sure this record for you has been done for a while. And so now you're having to kind of go back to thinking about the foundation of why did this start? How did it start? And then thinking about, I remember when we were working on the videos, but then at the time, all of this wasn't going to be out for another 5 or 6 months and all of this stuff. So you're constantly existing in these 3 different planes of existence. And somehow it's how you have to traverse your creative life, not really existing in any one, but each one dictates what the other one's going to be. And it's kind of a weird thing to think about.
Yeah, it is. And then, I would say this process was quicker than anything I've ever been involved with. But for sure, I mean, I would lose sleep at night if I thought about whether it was my own music or artists I work with, decisions I made 10 or 15 years ago that I would change now, right? And so you can't really live in that past, but you could think about like, oh, we almost went this direction with a record, but at the moment we thought it was better to do this, and then looking back, with 10 years of perspective, no, that first idea would have been so much better, or if we would have made that record 6 months earlier, a year earlier, we were on to something that was better and maybe more timeless, but we, shifted. And, all these decisions, whatever, you'll go insane. You could think about that with, like I said, every aspect of your life, any type of job, any relationships. I mean, you have to live in the moment, make your best decision, and, time will tell, right?
I have a very ambiguous last question for you. What is something in your tenure in the music business that you take with you, like as your, I don't want to say a mantra, but it's something that like you take forward every day, like you try to put out in the world, like maybe a truth you've learned in the time?
Sure. I would say, I think I love creation, right? I'm jealous of a carpenter that could build a beautiful table or a beautiful bookcase. I love when anytime in the world you go from an idea to something exists in the world, right? And so my version of that is music, whether it's, I've done more records where I wasn't the writer, I wasn't the artist, but I helped them get the ideas from their head or their micro cassette, demo recording out into the world. And so I would say, if you look back on the things that have made you happy, it's spending time with the people you care about, and it's creating, right? So, and in this job, on a great day, it's both. You're hanging out with people you love and appreciate and respect, and you're creating something that didn't exist before. And, great albums can just, not to sound overreaching here, but it can change the world or can change your life forever. There's songs that you can listen to 25, 30 years later. It puts you right back in the van you were driving across, Kansas when you were listening to that song. And that's a beautiful thing. And music can mean so much for so many different people. And just getting to kind of add to the overall collection of music that's out in the world is great. And it's something I appreciate and I want to try to do honor by, because like I said, now that anyone can release a song, it's a blessing and a curse. Any kid with a laptop in their bedroom can create something, can have it out on the biggest platforms there are, can have it out on YouTube, have it out on Spotify. And so let's all try to do our part to, make it worthwhile and not just be clutter.
I thought of something as you were kind of answering my last question, and this is going to be a very weird last question. But listening to you and I talking over this last hour, it seems like you are someone that's very catering to helping others, being like more of a facilitator for a lot of other people's ideas and being there for others, which is kind of a lot of, I like to say, a conduit. You're a conduit for a lot of things, a lot of creative or positive things in your world. But it makes me wonder, what is your love language? Because I would be interested to see what it is, based on the fact that so much of what you do centers around helping others and not really necessarily helping yourself or putting yourself first.
I know, I'm trying to think of the list. Is there 5 or something?
Words of affirmation, gift giving. How I'm blanking on what they are, because essentially my wife and I just had like the same two.
Yeah, I know acts of service, I know, is one, and I know that's maybe what you're kind of implying is what maybe what I've said is what I'm giving out to the world.
Sorry. So here we are. So they are words of affirmation, quality time, physical touch, acts of service, receiving gifts.
Hey, let's go with quality time. Like I said, as I've gotten older, I can think back on the moments that mean so much more than any possession, right? Like anything you might be saving your money up to get, and once you get it, you realize it's, it was more fun having that money and like looking in your bank account and feeling stoked that like, I've built it up to this much, and then you get the thing. So like, yeah, let's do moments with the people you care about. And I kind of mentioned that, like to me, it's a tag team between creating things and then just having time with the people, whether it's your family, whether it's the friends that you make into your family, whatever. And now we're sounding like a weird self-help podcast, but yeah, that's what I'll go with.
All right. The last question for you: where can everyone find you, or anything you would like to plug online?
Yeah. Luckily, we're getting to the point where if you search Barbarians of California, it's coming up in all the applicable search engines. I'm just at Eric Stenman. You could find me. I don't do much on X. I don't do much on Instagram. I just kind of put I'm doing nowadays is through this band at the moment. So, but yeah, our record comes out on October 4th. Anyone that's in the Southern California area or feels like making it to the Southern California area, we are playing the Troubadour on October 19th. It'll be our first show, and we have a ton of friends playing with us, and it's going to be a party. It's the number of people all in one building. It's going to be like my wedding part 2. Like when you get married, you're the center of attention, and you have 50 to 200 people that all know you there. This is going to be somewhat along those lines, and so hopefully, like I said, some rowdy 19-year-olds show up as well that do some sing-alongs. But otherwise, it's going to be a great reunion, and looking forward to it.
I think one of the biggest things in my one time going out to LA and seeing some of the old venues, like went to the Roxy and the Viper Room, and I was so enamored with this because you just don't see it anywhere else, is sort of the pomp and circumstances of like every venue I went to had that little kabuki curtain, basically. And I thought that was so interesting that I was like, nowhere else, maybe in New York, I haven't spent much time out that way, but maybe they're still holding on to that kind of grandiose, like this is an event, this is something that like you present. And I just thought it was so interesting. I was like, what is the fascination with still holding on to this? Like, you just don't see it anywhere else. So I would almost want to go just to see that reveal of like you guys playing, like, and here we are, Barbarians of California.
I don't think Troubadour has a curtain. I know what you mean with the Viper Room. That's a memory that I'd kind of forgotten, that the Viper Room, I think, always did have the curtain, that you at least had the option to close the curtain while you were, setting up. I don't believe that Troubadour does that, but I'm really proud to get to play there. Troubadour has always been my favorite LA venue. And so when we were putting this together, there was a bunch of ideas. And I was just like beeline, just please Troubadour, please Troubadour, please Troubadour. And so it happened. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and enjoy the rest of your day. And hopefully you guys will be able to hit the road in the upcoming year. And
where are you today?
All the way to California. I'm in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Yeah,
okay.
so I'm in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had some good times there, and one of my best friends, Mark Hudson, lives. Boy, he lives in a smaller town. I'm not gonna think of the name, but yeah, I'm a fan. I'm a fan of that area.
So that was my conversation with Eric. Want to thank him once again for taking the time to chat about this new album and some past projects and just his career and kind of where the music industry has been and where it's going from his perspective. And, you know, it's kind of one of those things too, you know, in thinking about the vibe of the last few weeks episodes, you know, like with Gore and 156 Silence, you know, it's a lot of quote unquote newer bands. And while Barbarians of California is a newer band, there's a little bit of nostalgia attached to it. It's made by some weathered folks, some people who have put in some time into their craft and into their careers in the music industry. And I think that's kind of like a nice blend right now, like of where these episodes are of just kind of finding new things and something I'm kind of getting excited about. I haven't made one of these in a while because I sometimes feel like it doesn't fucking matter, but sometimes I feel like it is a way for people to find music maybe that they missed or bands that they missed or just, I don't know. It can be beneficial to make these, but thinking about album of the year lists, and honestly, when I first heard this record, you know, it kind of scratched an itch I didn't know I needed to have itched. It kind of, for me, and this may be a weird reference, but for me, it's going to kind of fill maybe the Refused void. Now that Refused is officially calling it a day, thankfully, my friends and I are going to go next year and go see them. We're going to pay our respects. We were there when they came back. Felt fitting to see that band go, but I think a band like Barbarians of California coming out now is almost very fitting that it will kind of replace sort of where Refuse kind of has left me. And I know that sounds kind of weird to a degree because some people would be like, well, they don't sound like Refuse necessarily, but for me, they kind of scratch that same kind of an itch. So I'm really excited to see some more touring from the band. Like, you know, since we've done this episode, the band has played a couple of live shows, or at least their one live show, I should say. And, you know, it seems like maybe there will be some more shows or light touring, maybe next year. So it'd be really cool to check out this band because I would be intrigued to see what this looks like. And I feel like it would be such a cathartic release for these guys, like where it's equal parts fun, but it's equal parts like just raw aggression and just kind of like it just has to come out of you. It's a very cathartic thing, I feel like, for these guys. If you know, I get to see them perform, I feel like that's what it's going to be for me, like getting to hear these jams. And honestly, sometimes as I get older now, it's just fun to have a couple of drinks and enjoy good music and seeing it live. And I'm stoked. Hopefully 2025, Barbarians of California will be out here somewhere in the Midwest so I can go check them out, or perhaps in one of my travels, or maybe if I'm lucky enough to get on to one of these DWP festivals for next year and see if maybe they happen to get on one of them, or like an Aftershock or something like that out in California. But gonna start wrapping this up because my voice sucks right now. I've been fighting a cold for like the last 2 or 3 weeks. It's partially the other reason I haven't done a whole lot of new podcasts because I've just been fighting off whatever this gnarly cold is. And honestly, being here in Michigan as we are experiencing sort of fall going into winter weather where it could be 60 something, almost 70 degrees one day. And then I think like next week, it's going to be down in the low 30s. So winter is about to hit and my body does not know how to react to it. So it just wants to get sick. So as someone who does this, that really sucks. So to start wrapping everything up, if you like Keep Up with Barbarians of California, you can go to thebarbariansofcalifornia.com. Otherwise, Facebook, Barbarians of CA, Instagram, Barbarians of CA, and you guessed it, Twitter, Barbarians of CA. If you like to keep up with Eric, you can find him at ericstenman.com. Otherwise, Instagram is at ericstenman, as well as Twitter. If you would like to keep up with the podcast, you can do so at BrewSpeakPod on all your major social media platforms. Email me at brewtallyspeaking@gmail.com with guest suggestions, show reviews, whatever. Keep the conversation going. And again, speaking of rating, reviewing, all those things, you know why those are important. Please do such if you have the time. And speaking of time, I want to save you time and money. And you know where I can save you time and money this holiday season? Go over to rockabilia.com. Check out their online store, which has, dare I say, hundreds of thousands of items in there. new items being added, new collaborations happening with the hottest new bands, some vintage older bands that maybe you didn't know you needed new merch from. I mean, Metallica's been around for, I don't even want to say how long, but Metallica has new merch coming out that's exclusive to Rockabilia. So head on over there, check out their stuff. If you find something that is perfect for you or for a loved one, pick it up for the holiday season. Use our code BREWtally at checkout. Take 10% off your total purchase order. Support them for supporting us. I want to thank them so much for everything they've done over the handful of years of being a sponsor of this podcast. And for the Brewtally Speaking podcast, I am John, and I will see you next week with another John Cooper of Skillet. That was a really interesting one. We'll get into that on that one. I will see you all next week. Enjoy the rest of yours.